Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Neurotech.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Lindsey Jardine, and she is a clinical project manager at Boston Scientific. And basically, she's helping put together clinical trials in medical device technologies, but she's also had experience in neurotechnology, especially. And I think this is the first time we've ever really talked. We've done a deep dive into what do clinical trials mean and how do they work, and from somebody with expert in this topic. Lindsey, pleasure to have you on the show. Do you want to introduce yourself better than I just did?
Yeah, no, that was pretty great. Yeah, so clinical project manager at Boston Scientific, recently acquired. Neurotech, Biomedical, that's been my bread and butter since I graduated undergrad. So that's, I don't know about expert, but it's been a few years.
Excellent. So what is a clinical trial? Let's just do complete basics. Why is this necessary? What is a clinical trial and why is it necessary?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Oddly enough, I get asked that question quite frequently, even by the people I work with. But clinical trials, if you think of, let's start with startup kind of, you have an idea, what do you do with it? So first thing you have to do is you have to build it. You have a theory about it, you build it, make sure that it works. And then you have this thing and you're like, how do I test it in humans? What do I do? How do I get it from my idea that I've already built it and bring it to the market? You're a PhD, you already know all the engineering, all the things that go into it. So once you've tested all that and tested the materials to make sure it works on the bench, then you need to start testing it in animals. And so that's where the clinical trial comes in. So that's a preclinical. That's also a really big part of my job, is working with those preclinical studies to make sure that we're up on the regulatory, we're making a good plan for the future when it comes to the in-human trials. So after you test it in animals, then you test it in humans. So you do a first in human study, and then you do some bigger studies that you want to present to the FDA or whatever your authoritative body is. So that's the gist of what a clinical trial is. How do you get it from the preclinical phase, which is after your first time you tested it in any kind of tissue, to all the way to market?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So what is this process like? And I've heard that in pharmaceuticals, this is a very long and lengthy process. So how do medical devices, maybe neurotechnology, compare to that in all those phases?
Yes. So pharmaceuticals generally take a lot longer than medtech. Pharmaceuticals, there's just a lot more, they generally take a lot more people, and that's a lot of recruiting. That's also a lot of follow-up, because you want to make sure that all the long-term effects of any kind of pharmaceuticals are studied very thoroughly. Medtech is a little bit faster, because usually we're talking about a surgery. So I specifically I've done some wearables too, but for surgical purposes, it's, did the person survive surgery, and is there an efficacy standard met? So there's a few ways to go about that. So you can do a non-inferiority study, which is, we think we're just as good as everything else on the market. So that would be a non-inferiority study. And that generally would abide by the same kind of timelines as every other surgical kind of implementation. So anything, if you're going to say in cardiovascular ablation, it'd be a 90-day to 6 months. So you only have to follow the patients for up to 6 months. But yes, to assume efficacy. And then there's a superiority study, which says, I am significantly better than everybody else on the market. And then you have to go above and beyond to prove that you're better. That's a little bit more risky. That's a really big claim, but it's also something it's been done. It's very possible.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, so what does this process look like? What's maybe a timeline, I guess, the preclinical, right? Starting with animals, and let's say what's a typical timeline, cost, everything for that, and then what are the next steps after that?
Yeah, good questions. So preclinical, you usually would do, I would say, cradle to grave, 5 years. So that's and obviously this is very dependent on the technology. Neuro tends to be a little bit slower. Cardio goes a little bit faster, depending on the technology, whatever it is your primary endpoint is. But your preclinical animal trials usually last about 2 years. And while you're doing that, you're also planning for the next phase, which is your clinical trials. So then while you're doing all your animal trials, you're setting up for all of your clinical trials. And all of your clinical trials generally take, for primary endpoints, about 2 years. And then while you're doing all that, there's another bigger clinical trial that you're working on. So that'd be like a PMA or a 510K or something like that. And then all those timelines really overlap. Cost wise, tens of millions of dollars, half $1 billion sometimes, depends on how big your clinical trial is and what you're really trying to accomplish. And all of this kind of ties into your end marketing point, I guess, is what I'm trying to say is, do you want to get acquired? Do you want to go IPO? What is the minimum you can do if you're trying to get acquired to become acquired? So that's significantly less cost, a lot less time on the bench, a lot less time in the lab, and a lot less subjects in your clinical trial. So it all depends on what your end goal is. So that's a rough estimation, anywhere between 5 to 10 years, depending on what the study is, what the technology is, what your endpoints are, and what your end goal for the entire company is going to be.
So where does the time get used up, and then where does the money get used up? Is it buying you a second boat or what?
I would love a first boat, would be great. So a lot of it goes into the R&D. So I would say that most budgets for starting a company, a lot of it, you have to build it. And that's the engineering. That's also the manufacturing. So you have to actually build the product, which is really expensive. Finding those manufacturers that you can work with, that's really expensive. I think in any company, I would say personnel is a really big headcount, or headcount's a really big cost. So it depends on how many people you have brought in. And also you have to pay all your hospitals, all your physicians, all the people who are participating in the study. So all of that goes into a bunch of costs. And then with clinical trials, you can choose to run it in-house, meaning like you would have a higher headcount, meaning more long-term people on your payroll. So more full-time employees, or you can hire a clinical research organization. So you would give those responsibilities to somebody who's already working in specifically clinical trials, and then you contract them to run your clinical trial. So that's going out to all of your sites, doing these site initiation visits, or contacting all these physicians to get them on board with the contracts and the budgeting and all that stuff. So it's a really delicate balance. When you do use a clinical research organization or CRO, then it's a lot of money, but then you also don't have to worry about keeping those people in-house. So once the study's done, then you don't have to keep them. That being said, you lose a lot of control when you hand over a large portion of your study to a CRO or contract research organization. All of it depends on what you want to do, what your long-term goals are, and what your and what your runway is, honestly. Because if it's a small study and you're only trying to get to an acquisition endpoint, and you can run it in-house, and then assuming that everyone's going to either leave after the acquisition or they're going to be absorbed into a bigger company, then you can bring in all those resources. If you want to contract it out because they have the infrastructure that you already need, and that's also completely acceptable. The last study that I worked on, we used a CRO. The study before that, we also used a CRO. The study before that, we did it all in-house. So it 100% depends on how much control you want to give over and what your infrastructure is for running a clinical trial, if that makes sense.
You mentioned
budgets will vary wildly. Like that was a complicated question. So I'm not trying to avoid your question.
Hey guys, just a quick pause to talk about our show sponsor, Iris Biomedical. Iris Biomedical provides a portfolio of neural sensing and simulation platforms and components to accelerate early-stage medical device companies through preclinical and early feasibility studies. Iris is an ideal partner for companies with limited budgets or resources to invest in developing a new platform from the ground up. Their experienced engineering team, in-house cleanroom facilities, and ISO 13485 certified quality management system allow for prototyping and early-stage commercial production. Be sure to tell them you heard about it on the Neural Implant Podcast. That'll really help us out. Thanks. Now, back to the show. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about budgets and how they vary, why they vary, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So budgets, how big is your study? And a lot of it is how big is your study and how fast do you need to get it done. If your study is really big, then you're going to have a very big budget for it. And you need to, just because I'm specifically talking about medtech here. So you're building a device, you have to manufacture all these devices. You have to pay all these physicians. So depending on the university and your contracts and budgets, it's tens of thousands of dollars more than tens of thousands of dollars per site. And then if you're doing a 50 site study, Then there's all of that. And then that's also getting in all the regulatory burden. So paying the FDA to audit you, to review your study. And then you have to have regular check-ins with the FDA. That's also like tens of thousands of dollars to do. And then if you're doing a multinational study, then there's a lot more money involved with traveling and getting things through customs and it's a lot, depending on how big your study is, how long you're going to be running it for. So your physicians are going to get paid, your physicians, and sorry, I'm using physicians as like a catch-all. It's a physician and physician staff. So everybody on their staff, so their nurses, their research coordinators, all these people, and their contracts and budget people, everybody gets paid for all the work that they do, because they are honestly doing so much work for every single study I've ever seen. Yeah. So it's a lot of negotiations that happen. And I highly recommend hiring professionals for that, because I do it, but it's one of those things that like contracting out is very beneficial.
Yeah. It sounds like a lot of moving parts and
a lot of moving parts and a lot of,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Up one of them could get your stuff stuck in customs for God knows how long, and you halt everything for months. It's the bane of my existence. A lot of logistics, a lot of moving parts in a clinical trial. So what does your day-to-day look like? Are you running these, and then are you like walking into clinics and like talking to patients, or what does your job entail? Yes. Aside from the talking to patients, I let the physicians generally handle, the physicians and physician staffers generally handle all of the patient interactions. So that also goes to HIPAA regulations and everything like that. Patients do sign HIPAA consents for everybody involved to see or to understand and know their medical history, because it definitely pertains to everything that we use. Obviously, they're all data points that we need. But so day to day, there's lots of logistics coordinating, lots of logistics meetings, a lot of data, depending on what phase of the clinical trial is. Early on, it's a lot of building the protocol. So meeting with your executives, your chief medical officer, your chief technology officer to write an appropriate protocol for what we're trying to accomplish. So lots of logistics meetings and lots of back and forth with that. And then simultaneously, you have your field team that's recruiting physicians and hospitals to join the study. So you have to have a forward already written so you can give that to the physicians so they can become interested. And then it's a lot of conferences to go meet people. So you have to fly out to these conferences to meet physicians, to get them interested, to want to be a part of your study. And then I would say another phase of the trial is setting up the actual sites. So once you've written your protocol and you've written your database, so that your database is all the data points that you want to collect for the study. So that's working with your chief technology officer and your chief medical officer to make sure that you're collecting all the relevant data points and you haven't missed anything. Because if you get to the very end and you're writing your final report and you're like, oh my God, why didn't we collect hemoglobin or whatever it was? A lot of writing for the data points. So you want to collect all the valid data points, and then it's site setup. In each country, there's a standard regulatory burden that needs to happen. So you have to have your physician medical licenses and insurance policies and all that stuff. So a lot of regulatory stuff that you have to collect for each physician. And then, so in the site setup portion, there's a lot of flying out to sites, meet the people, teach them the protocol and or the surgical, whatever you're going to be testing, you have to teach them how to use it. And then they start recruiting patients. And then that is the chaos mode, basically. So it's always getting data points, making sure everything's being collected properly. If there's a problem with any site, that's always a really tough one to give them what's called a CAPA, which is a corrective action plan. And then, for most clinical trials, you'll have somebody from the field, your field team, somebody who specializes in, so they're usually like a surgical tech or a nurse or a physician. I've had physicians come out of a hospital just to do field work, which is fantastic. But they're those people that you see in surgical suites teaching the physicians or watching the physicians use a device. So they're the technical experts. So if there's ever a question or anything that goes wrong, they also know the protocol inside and out. So if there's a question on how to use the device properly or what data points to collect while you're in surgery, stuff like that. So you have your field team, they're flying all over the country. And then me personally, I'm on the back end trying to help coordinate all that fun stuff.
and making sure that we are getting all the data points that we need. And then also getting the devices to site. So when you're in a startup, that's actually one of the most difficult things that I've found while you're actually running the study, is making sure those devices are getting to the sites, which is depending on where your manufacturer is. So this last study that I ran, our manufacturer was in Canada. So that's one of the, trying to get it across the border, trying to get it through customs is a really tough one. You have to have all the regulatory paperwork in place to get it across customs. The last study that I ran was during Brexit, and 5 of my sites were in what is formerly known as the European Union. And trying to figure out the logistics on getting our devices there so they can enroll patients, so we can collect the data, so we can get it, submit a PMA. We did a PMA with the last 2 studies that I had. Yeah. So it's just while you're in startup or while you're in study running mode, it's a lot of logistics and a lot of data cleaning. And then once you've closed enrollment, it's another lot of flying out to sites. So a lot of flying out to sites, say thank you, all the things, clean the data, make sure everything is above the bar. So if the FDA decides to pop in and audit somebody, you know that all of your sites have a squeaky clean record, and you can say audit whoever you like. And then it kind of slows down a little bit where you're writing your final report for the FDA. So it's a lot of data cleaning. Then you start bringing in your biostatisticians, and they make tables and they're running all the data and making sure everything is clean and presentable. And then that's actually one of my favorite parts, is actually like seeing it all put together after the biostatisticians have run all their magic. I'm going to call it magic. It's not magic, it's math, but it's still one of my favorite things, is like reading the final, like just statistical reports and then putting those into the report that you were working on for the last 2 years, and then submitting it to the FDA. And then most of the time, the FDA will audit you, getting ready for audit. So that's, again, working with your chief medical officer, your chief technical officer, and making sure everything is ready. When the FDA does audit you, it's all of the clinical trial and then everything leading up to the clinical trial. So all of those things are in the purview for any kind of audit. Yeah. And then hopefully you submit and get approval.
Wow, this sounds like a job for somebody who's extremely detail oriented, loves to just get every detail correct. I don't know, for me that doesn't sound very attractive. You're not really selling it too much to me.
Oh no.
How did you get into it? And we talked about this a little bit before, but this seems a very strange thing to fall into.
Yes, it is. It really is. So I probably didn't do a very good job of it, but it's solving problems constantly, and it's never the same problem twice, which is really fun for me, which is why I like it. The way I got into it was in undergrad. I went to undergrad. I was going to be a physician, or I wanted to be a physician, ER doctor, which is, now that you're saying this, very strange transition, but I love chaos and I love just like putting out fires left and right. Study biochemistry, love physics. That was always like my 2 favorite topics or classes. And so graduated, anybody who graduates with a degree in biochemistry generally goes into chemistry or genetics. So I started working in genetics, and it was really fun solving the problems. And then came time for the pipetting. And then I was like, what? I have to do this for 10 years? What? So a chemistry PhD generally takes a very long time. I wanted to get some bench research in and then apply for med school. So took my MCAT, applied for med school, got into med school. And then I started filling out all of the financial aid paperwork. And I was like, oh God, this is a lot. And then I started looking around to all my friends who were physicians, and they were all miserable. I did not know one physician that actually enjoyed their job. Every single one of them was looking forward to retirement or looking forward to not being at work. And I was like, that doesn't seem like a great idea. Why would you want to live like that? I postponed, decided to start working in clinical research, which I didn't even know clinical research was a thing when I was in college. Had no idea what it was. But so when I was at UCSD, I was working in the lab, and then one of the PIs, principal investigators, asked me to start collecting samples in his clinic for one of our studies, or for one of his studies. I wasn't working on the study, but I also, weird other thing that I did in my past was I was a paramedic. So I knew how to draw blood. So they asked me to come in, I drew some blood, and then I was like, oh, what is this? And he's, oh, it's one of my clinical trials. I was like, I don't know what that means. What is a clinical trial? And I started talking to him about what a clinical trial was. And I started reading the protocols and seeing that there's a lot of patient interaction with that, which at the moment I really loved. So I asked if I could start working on a couple of his studies in the clinic. And in addition to being in the lab, I started working in clinic as a clinical research coordinator and really love that. But I could see someday that being in clinic is a very repetitive thing. And it's a lot of the same thing over and over again, which is also not my jam. I really like the constant chaos and putting out fires. And as much as I love seeing the outcome from clinical trials, the actual daily implementation is very, very repetitive and not really something that was going to keep me interested for a very long time. So that's when I came into the startup world, which everything is always chaos. And no matter what part of startup life you're in, it's always chaos. So that's when I started working at Cala Health. And then from there, I've worked at 3 other startups. I had my own startup for a little while, and that still is going. But yeah, so it was a long, twisty, windy road. It was, instead of going down like the traditional path, I just got really distracted by the things that were shiny and I thought were going to make me happier than the traditional path. So I and love what I do. I know the chaos and all the logistics and the detail orientation. It's not, yes, it is very detail oriented, but you can just get used to that part because I'm also not a very detail oriented person. I'm a high level strategy, logistics kind of girl. But yeah, I really love all the choices that I made. It was very confusing for a long time because it's not traditional. It's definitely a path that I was completely unsure of for such a long time. I thought I had epically messed up my life by not going to med school, but now I'm really happy.
So you took a windy path, but what would be the path that you would recommend? How, if people somehow liked what you've been talking about, what should they do?
Oh man. Oh, that's a really good question. I've never even thought of that. I know that there are master's programs in clinical research, master's in clinical trial design, or I think it's clinical research management is a master's program. I think to be in clinical research, you have to have a science background. So I would highly recommend chemistry. I'm a little biased, but chemistry, physics, I think having a really good grasp and understanding of your technology and of the statistics and how everything logically gets put together is invaluable. And I think that's where I see the separation between, that's when you see the cream of the crop rise, because you go about thinking of clinical trials in, I've seen this before, top down kind of expression of a clinical trial. It doesn't really work. You need to be able to think with the engineers. You need to be able to work with your medical officers. So having a really good grounded understanding of science and science basics is essential. So I would highly recommend something, chemistry, engineering, physics. Those are all things if somebody is thinking about a career in clinical research, for an undergrad program, I would say start there. Start with something that's really rooted in science, like a hard science. For a master's program, it's engineering. Honestly, if I could go back right now, I would definitely go back and do an engineering degree, just because it's invaluable to understand how your technology works. So whatever technology, I'm not including pharmaceuticals here. So then maybe like a pharma graduate degree, but for specifically medtech, I would say understanding how your technology works is crucial. And if you're smart, you can figure it out. But if you want to go on to a graduate program, engineering is something that I would definitely look into.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And then just work your way into working with these companies. If you have those degrees, they would hire you, or?
Oh, yeah. That is a good question. I think how did I get into Cala? I was working at Stanford and I was putting together the Google Watch clinical trial, which was hugely complicated and really fun to work with. But then I decided that academia is not really my space. So I got lucky. I just went on LinkedIn and found some recruiters. But I know that every company that I've ever worked for has an internship program. So it depends on what you want to get into, but it's not too hard to find people or to find startups that are looking for interns or people with a good degree who want to learn the space. Now, getting in is the difficult part because with startups specifically, they're very personality based. You have to be able to jive with the whole team. So find the space that works well for you and find the technology that you're really passionate about. Because if you have the passion, then people are going to recognize that. And they're really going to want to put you on their team, because if you're passionate about it, if you're curious about it, that's what everybody is there for, because we're passionate and we're curious and we want to make something cool. And we want to bring it to people who need help.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, a lot of times the startups want somebody who's experienced. Everybody in the boat needs to be pulling their weight. Everybody needs to be paddling, especially because there might be only like 4 or 5 people paddling. So
Oh yeah. That's a really good point, actually. Being a self-starter, I think that's been applied in a startup mode, but there's no resting on your laurels. There are no laurels. I get challenged every single day by everybody on my team, and it's welcome. Everybody's got questions. Everybody's trying to figure it out and answer. And you also have to be very multifaceted when you get into clinical trials, just because it is such a small team and you have to be able to do the contracts and budgets and the data and understand the engineers and work with the operations team. So you really have to be multifaceted and seeing a problem and wanting to fix it. It's the only, you will not survive in a startup world if you can't find a problem to solve. If you're just sitting there waiting for a direction, nobody's going to give it to you.
Yeah. Speaking of startups, you've probably seen a lot of neurotech and medtech startups.
Yeah.
What's a common mistake that they make and that could be easily avoided? You're pulling your hair out every time you see it.
Oh man. I think that my biggest problem with startups is wanting to do too much. And that one just drives me nuts, because if you have this great device and you're like, but we could do all these other things with it. I was like, no, one thing. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? Come up with one thing that you're trying to solve and do that really well, and then create a pipeline. So trying to create a pipeline while you're trying to create a flagship is not going to work. You're going to run out of runway. You're going to stretch your people way too thin. And it's just not really the right move, and it drives me nuts. So that being said, once you get to a good place with your flagship, your initial device, then start thinking about your pipeline. That's a great idea. But when you're starting, before you start your clinical trials, you have to have just one device that you're going to work on. And you have to make sure that's a really good device, because if you're trying to develop 8 things at once, you're not going to get there and you're going to run out of money. And that's how I see a lot of startups fail.
So focus.
Focus.
So is that just indications, or what do they lose focus on?
I think it's just the curse of the creative. So it's a lot of people saying, oh, this is really cool. How about we tweak it this way? Or this is really cool. How about we tweak it that way? And tweaking is great, but come up with your need to have, like what is nice to have, what is need to have. Who else is coming to market with it too? So if you're in the neurotech space and you're developing this product and then Abbott's coming up with something really similar, then you need to get there before Abbott. And Abbott's a big company, or Medtronic or Boston, whoever it is. There are other companies that are going to be able to try and do the same thing that you're doing. So you need to get there first. So come up with your nice to haves and your need to haves and get there fast, because somebody else is going to beat you to market. And if whoever is first on the market with the best device, they're going to capture more of that space. Yeah, it's the curse of the creative. Adding that camera or that imaging software or whatever it is a nice to have, or decide if it's a need to have. But it's also really killer. It's a killer in the startup space. And same thing with clinical trial design. To even come back a little bit, what is your clinical trial design? Come up with something that is efficient and effective, not the bells and whistles, the nice to haves versus the need to haves. You really need to focus down on your need to haves and why. And then if you want to run a post-market study, those are all nice to haves. Or if you want to run a bigger study with your pipeline device, so something with the imaging software on there, then you can put all the bells and whistles on that one. But getting there first is probably work with your marketing team and your executive team on direction. But that is one thing that I see in the startup space that is an absolute killer, is too much creativity, great creativity, fantastic creativity, but focus.
Do the big guys have an advantage, a speed advantage? They have just more resources to throw at us. Maybe the trials go faster, or are they just lumbering giants and the startups are faster, more nimble? What is your experience with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually feeling that right now. It's The big guys tend to go a lot slower because there's a lot more cooks in the kitchen. However, that being said, they have a lot more resources. They go a lot slower, but they have a lot more money and they also have a bigger reputation. So they can attract those PIs that really just want to put their name on a big name or really want to, or they can pay these people more, the PIs more. They go slower, but they're not as maneuverable. Go slower, they're not as maneuverable, but they have a lot more runway. They also have a lot more runway than any startup because they pull from lots of different projects and lots of different sources and they have a revenue basically. And as a startup, you don't have revenue yet.
And usually clinical trials, they have to be raised off of grants or investment money. So your runway is pretty short, right?
Yeah. So you raise grants. Grants usually don't last for very long. A grant would be in the early stages of your kind of engineering. That's when you would use up that budget. Then you raise, and then maybe you'd have some strategic investors. So somebody like an Abbott saying, hey, I really like your technology. I don't want to build it. So let's fund you and see where it goes.
Okay. Yeah, it's very cool. Yeah, this is a very exciting world, and hopefully I'll be able to dip my toes in it one day. It's a dream to have a startup, and I think it's really cool. Lindsey, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
That's a good question. Lots of really, really good questions. I would say as far as clinical research goes, it's a twisty, windy road, and it's a lot of fun. And it's constantly changing. I know I probably didn't sell the daily very well, but it is really fun putting out fires all the time. And I'm a high adrenaline person. I go rock climbing, I skydive, I ride motorcycles. It really is you're constantly meeting milestones, which is also really great. Being able to bring a study across the finish line and looking at the faces of the people who worked on this for their PhD project. And they're like, oh my God, we just got acquired, or, oh my God, we just went IPO. And you're the one that took their dream across the finish line. And it's just a really rewarding aspect of being a part of a startup is, it's that high pressure, high intensity. It may be very meticulous and there's a lot of really difficult parts to it and a lot of probably really boring parts to it. There are a lot of really boring parts to it, but it is very rewarding. You're always reaching those milestones, you're hitting those milestones, and seeing it come across the finish line and seeing something come to market is really fun. So I highly encourage it. Anybody who's looking into it, I highly recommend reaching out to your clinical trial people and seeing what their daily is. Even preclinical, that's a lot of fun too, testing in animals and seeing how effective your devices are really fun. I highly recommend everybody look into it and learn a little bit more about it. And I hope I taught you guys, everybody in podcast land, all about it, a little bit about it.
Yeah, excellent. This has been very educational, probably the deepest dive we've done so far. So yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, good. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.